The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where my son used to be. My heart felt heavy, a weight that I could hardly describe. The echo of his words rang in my ears. "My wife calls the shots here, you're leaving." His voice, loud and forceful, had torn through the calm that once existed between us. I never thought I would hear those words from him. Not in a million years. It was as if the relationship we had spent years building had suddenly been ripped apart by a single moment of anger. I could still picture the scene vividly. My son, once a young boy who would cling to my side, now standing tall with an authority I had never seen before. His face was flushed with emotion, and his eyes held a mix of anger and frustration. His wife, standing beside him, looked on with a certain coldness, her presence almost like a silent agreement to what was happening. I didn't know where to place myself anymore, whether as the parent who had raised him or the outsider in his life now. Our relationship, once strong and full of mutual respect, had started to fray in recent years. The shift had been gradual, small disagreements over the years, things I dismissed at first as mere misunderstandings. But this was different. The tension had been building for some time, unnoticed, until it exploded in this single moment. It was more than just an argument. It felt like an ultimatum, a clear message that the family I had known was changing, and I wasn't a part of it anymore. I thought back to the early days when he was a child. We had been close then, closer than I ever imagined we'd be. He'd tell me everything, his hopes, his fears, his dreams. I was always there for him, but somewhere along the way I had lost that connection. It was hard to pinpoint when exactly it had started. Was it when he started college? Or perhaps when he met her, his wife? At first I welcomed her into our family with open arms, but over time things shifted. She had a way of making sure she was always in control, always pulling the strings whether I liked it or not. In the past, I would try to voice my concerns, but my words fell on deaf ears. Each time I would feel more and more like an outsider in my own family. Little things, like the way she'd make decisions without consulting me, or how he'd defer to her for everything, began to hurt. But I didn't want to make waves, so I kept quiet, letting my frustration build. And now, here I was, sitting alone in this quiet house, with nothing but the ringing silence of his words. "You're leaving!" It felt like the world had turned upside down in an instant. My son, the person I had loved and nurtured, had pushed me out of his life. The realization stung more than I could bear, but there was nothing I could do about it. How did we get here? And why was I the one left to pick up the pieces? The questions swirled in my mind as I struggled to understand the deep ache inside my chest. I remember the day my son was born, as if it were yesterday. It was the most miraculous moment of my life, watching this tiny little person come into the world. I had always dreamed of being a parent, and holding him in my arms for the first time felt like I had finally fulfilled my life's purpose. From that day on, I was determined to be the best parent I could be, to guide him, nurture him, and love him unconditionally. As a child, he was everything I could have hoped for, curious, kind, and incredibly bright. His laughter was the soundtrack of our home, and his eagerness to learn kept me on my toes. I was the one who helped him with his homework, attended his school plays, and coached him through the rough patches of childhood. There was never a moment when I wasn't involved in his life. I felt incredibly close to him during those years. I remember sitting by his bed at night, reading him stories, and watching him drift off to sleep with a peaceful smile on his face. Those moments, simple as they were, meant everything to me. I vividly recall the day he came home from school in high school, his face filled with excitement and anxiety. He had just received his college acceptance letter. It was a proud moment for both of us, but also one tinged with the realization that he was growing up, becoming more independent. I remember giving him a hug that day, whispering how proud I was of him. But inside, I also felt a deep sense of loss. The little boy I had raised was slowly starting to take his own path, one that didn't always include me. As he entered adulthood, I did my best to remain a constant presence, though I felt the shifts taking place. It wasn't like it used to be. He didn't need me as much anymore. I had tried to stay involved, to offer advice when he asked for it, but sometimes it felt like he was pushing me away, even in subtle ways. Our conversations became more surface level, filled with pleasantries, but lacking the deeper connection we once had. I was aware of the growing distance, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't know how to bridge that gap between us without making him feel suffocated, so I gave him space, hoping he'd come back to me on his own. Then one day, I was introduced to her. His girlfriend, later to be his wife, came into our lives with a quiet confidence. She was beautiful, poised, and seemed to have everything figured out. I remember my first impression of her. She was polite, but there was something about her that made me feel like an outsider in my own family. I pushed the feeling aside, thinking maybe I was overreacting. After all, this was someone my son cared for deeply, and I wanted to welcome her into our family with open arms. At first, the dynamics between us were cordial. I made an effort to get to know her, to engage in conversations and share experiences. But slowly, I began to notice certain things that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't anything overt, but rather the little signs of control she seemed to exert over him. She would often speak for him, making decisions without consulting him. And I noticed how easily he would defer to her. Whether it was about where they would spend holidays, or even which friends they would associate with, her influence was unmistakable. At first, I attributed it to their close relationship, thinking perhaps I was just being overly sensitive. But over time, I couldn't ignore the feeling that he was becoming more distant from me, more focused on her opinions and desires than his own. When they would visit, I could sense an underlying tension. There were subtle disagreements, things like how he'd make plans without asking for my input, or how she would interrupt during family dinners to steer the conversation in a direction she preferred. It was as though her presence overshadowed mine, and I was left trying to find my place in their world. One particular moment stands out in my mind. It was during the holiday season, and I had planned a small family gathering at our house. I had gone to great lengths to make sure everything was perfect. But when my son and his girlfriend arrived, there was an unease in the air. I noticed the subtle way she would suggest changes to the plans, making it clear that she preferred things to be done her way. I was irritated but tried to brush it off. It wasn't a big deal, I told myself. She's just trying to be involved. But what really bothered me was how easily my son went along with her suggestions. I could see it in his eyes. He was loyal to her, perhaps even a little afraid to rock the boat. I felt like I was being pushed aside, as if my opinion no longer mattered. It wasn't just about holiday plans. It was about the way our relationship had evolved. I was no longer the first person he turned to for guidance. It was her. And though I tried to accept it, the truth stung more than I cared to admit. As the years passed, this dynamic continued. There were other moments that left me feeling marginalized, moments where I could see how she controlled the conversation, the decisions, the direction of their lives. I tried to hold on to the hope that things would get better, that the close relationship we had once shared would return. But every time I reached out, it felt like I was met with resistance. She was always there, always between us, like a barrier I couldn't cross. I began to wonder if this was the inevitable course of life, that children grow up, form their own families, and eventually move away from the parents who once held such a central place in their lives. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just that. The more I observed, the more I realized how much influence she had on him. It wasn't just love that bound them. It was control, manipulation, and a subtle but unmistakable push to choose her over anyone else. As I thought about all of this, I felt a deep sadness creeping in. My son was no longer the young boy who needed me, and the woman he had chosen to spend his life with, well, she wasn't someone I felt I could easily talk to, let alone trust. I had tried to be understanding, to accept the changes, but with every passing year, I felt more like an outsider in my own family. And now, with the outburst that had shaken me to my core, I couldn't help but wonder if I was losing him for good. The house felt heavier that afternoon, the kind of silence that had settled over us like a thick fog, suffocating everything in its path. I had invited my son and his wife over for dinner, hoping that some normalcy would return to our strained relationship. The months of distance, the awkwardness, and the quiet judgments had been gnawing at me. I tried to remind myself that maybe this was just a phase, maybe things would get better. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. The tension was palpable. even as I set the table with the hope of rekindling some kind of connection. It wasn't the first time we'd had a strained evening, but something felt different about tonight. Maybe it was the way my son walked in, his usual warmth replaced by something colder, more distant. Or maybe it was the look in his wife's eyes, as if she was already anticipating conflict. I wasn't sure, but I could feel the storm coming. Dinner started off innocuously enough. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about the weather, and caught up on trivial things. But there was an undercurrent, something unsaid between us, a tension that threatened to spill over. I tried to keep the conversation light, asking about their plans for the holidays, but there was a flicker in my son's eyes that I couldn't ignore. He was distracted, almost impatient, like he was waiting for the moment to unleash whatever had been bothering him. It came suddenly, like a crack of thunder in a quiet sky. "Mom, stop. You don't get it," my son snapped, his voice rising sharply as he pushed his chair back from the table. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor was almost louder than his words. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, my heart skipping a beat. His eyes locked with mine, a mixture of anger and frustration filling them. "My wife calls the shots here, you're leaving." The words landed like a punch to my gut. It took a few seconds for the meaning to fully settle in my mind, but once it did, it was like the air had been sucked out of the room. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat as the room fell silent. I couldn't move. My legs felt like jelly, my hands shaking slightly as I set my fork down. I looked from him to his wife, searching for any sign that this was some kind of joke. But she wasn't laughing. She wasn't even looking at me. Her gaze was fixed somewhere far off, as if she had seen this moment coming. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears as I tried to process what had just happened. The shock was overwhelming. This wasn't just an argument. This was a declaration, a final judgment. I wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but I couldn't find my voice. My son's words had cut so deeply, and I was paralyzed by the unexpected cruelty of it all. My mind scrambled to find any reason, any context for why he would say such a thing. I had done everything I could to be a part of his life, to remain involved, to offer support. But now, in this one moment, it felt like all of that had been thrown away. He was no longer the boy who had once sought my guidance, my love. The man standing before me was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. I turned to his wife, hoping for some kind of intervention. But she stood there, her expression cold and unreadable. If she felt any regret, any discomfort about what had just happened, she didn't show it. She simply watched, waiting for the fallout to settle. I didn't know if she was silently agreeing with him, or if she was just too tired of playing the mediator. Either way, her lack of reaction was just as painful as the words he had said. I took a deep breath, struggling to compose myself. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, to ask how we had arrived at this moment. But I felt like a stranger in my own home, as if I no longer had the right to question anything. It was as if everything I had done for him, all the sacrifices, the late nights, the years of support, had been erased in an instant. I thought of the memories we used to share, him running to me after a bad day at school, the way he'd hug me tightly, as if the world outside didn't matter. I remembered the pride I felt when he graduated, the joy in his eyes when he found his first job, the trust he once had in me. And now, all of it seemed so distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I was angry. I was devastated, but most of all, I felt rejected. It was as if he had chosen her, his wife, over everything else. I could hear her in the background, the soft hum of her presence, but it was clear. He had chosen her over me. My breath was shallow, my chest tight. I felt like I was suffocating in my own home. This was my son, the same boy I had raised, the one who once needed me for everything. And now, here he was, pushing me out of his life. I had tried to be understanding, to give him space, but this was different. This was a betrayal. This was final. My mind raced as I looked at him, then back at his wife. My emotions were a tangled mess: hurt, anger, confusion. But one thing was clear. I couldn't just let this slide. I couldn't pretend like everything was okay when my son had just thrown me aside so easily. In a moment of sheer impulse, I picked up my phone. I didn't know what I was doing, but the words spilled out of me before I could think about it. I called the bank and canceled his credit card. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't a calculated move. It was the only thing I felt I had control over in that moment. It was my way of saying, if I'm not important enough for you to respect, then I'll take something away. The action felt strange and hollow. Was it punishment? A desperate cry for attention? Or was it simply the result of a mother's heart breaking in a way she hadn't imagined possible? I didn't know. And in that moment, I didn't care. My emotions were too raw, too jagged to make sense of anything. All I knew was that my son had rejected me in front of his wife, and I felt helpless to stop it. When I hung up the phone, I looked at him, my son, the person I had raised, the person I had loved unconditionally, and I saw nothing but a stranger's face staring back at me. A cold, indifferent stranger. The words, "You're leaving," still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already been erased from his life, even before the card had been canceled. The morning after the argument, the house felt like a tomb. The weight of what had happened the night before hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating everything around me. I had gone to bed with a restless mind, but the emotional turmoil had only intensified overnight. The events replayed in my mind over and over. His words, her silence, my impulsive action of canceling his credit card. I had hoped that sleep would somehow offer clarity, but when I awoke, I felt just as lost, if not more so. I kept replaying the moment of the outburst, wondering if I had overreacted by canceling his card. What was I thinking? Was it really the right thing to do, or had it been an act of vengeance driven by hurt and pride? I knew I had to face the consequences, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. Part of me felt a fleeting sense of relief that I had for once taken control of a situation that had made me feel powerless for far too long. But another part of me, a larger part, was consumed with guilt. Was it petty to take such an action? Was it truly the way I had been raised to handle conflict? Could there have been another, more mature way to address this issue? The phone call to the bank had felt almost like an out-of-body experience, something done in a haze of emotion. But now, as the morning light crept through the curtains, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been a rash decision. Was this really how I wanted to handle things with my son? Through spite? Through anger? Through a cold withdrawal of resources? I had acted impulsively, but now I couldn't take it back, and I had no idea how this was going to affect our already fragile relationship. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I wrapped them around a cup of coffee. The phone on the counter remained silent, and I couldn't help but stare at it, willing it to ring. I wasn't sure what I expected. A message of apology, an explanation, maybe some sign that he was at least willing to acknowledge what had happened. But there was nothing. The silence stretched on, the minutes turning into hours. Eventually, I couldn't wait any longer. I called my son's cell phone. The phone rang once, twice, and then finally went to voicemail. I hung up before leaving a message. I didn't know what to say, but I couldn't force myself to speak when my heart was still so heavy. It wasn't long before I received a text message from him. My heart skipped a beat as I unlocked my phone, but the words stung more than I anticipated. "Why'd you cancel my card? What the hell is wrong with you? I'm an adult now. I make my own decisions." His message felt like a slap to the face. It was as though he had completely ignored the emotional weight of what had transpired between us. He hadn't acknowledged the years of closeness we had shared, nor did he seem to recognize the hurt and rejection I was feeling. It was as if the card cancellation was the only issue at hand, and not the greater, deeper rift that had opened up between us. He was angry, but there was no sense of remorse. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. I wanted to respond immediately, but the words that flooded my mind felt too sharp. I wanted to say everything. The hurt, the disappointment, the overwhelming sense of loss I was feeling, but I didn't want to escalate the situation. So, I decided to give him space, hoping that in time, he would come to understand the emotional weight of his actions. The next few days were a blur of emotion. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, but it was never from him. His silence spoke volumes. He hadn't reached out, not once. His wife, on the other hand, sent a message the day after the argument. But it wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of what had happened. Instead, it was a simple, cold message. "We need some time. Please respect our space." The words were polite, but they held an edge that cut deeper than any harsh words ever could. I found myself lost in a sea of regret. I began to question my decision. Did canceling the card really help anything? Or had I simply added more fuel to the fire? I had expected him to feel the weight of my hurt, to understand the depth of my emotions. But instead, it seemed to have further pushed him away. I had hoped that by taking this action, it would somehow force him to understand how much he had hurt me. But all it had done was make him dig his heels in further. Days turned into a week, and still, there was no word from him. The phone stayed silent. I began to lose hope that there would be any reconciliation anytime soon. Each day felt like a heavy burden, and the tension that had once been under the surface of our relationship now seemed permanent, unmovable. Then, unexpectedly, my son called. His voice was strained when I answered the phone, like he wasn't sure where to begin. The awkward silence between us was palpable, and for the first time, I realized how much had changed. It wasn't the casual, familiar tone we once shared. There was distance in his voice, a sense of unease that made my chest tighten. "Mom," he started, "I don't get why you did that. I know you're upset, but I'm an adult. I don't need you to control me." I felt my throat tighten as I processed his words. There was no apology, no recognition of the emotional pain he had caused. It was as if his actions were justified by the fact that he was no longer a child. His words came at me, sharp and defensive, and I realized just how far apart we had grown. This wasn't the son I had raised, the son who would confide in me, who would seek my advice, who would trust me with his deepest fears. Now, he was defensive, angry, and unwilling to acknowledge anything beyond his own frustration. "I'm not trying to control you, son," I said quietly, my voice trembling. "I'm trying to be there for you, and I felt rejected. I felt like you pushed me aside, like you're more loyal to her than you are to me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his tone softened, though it was still edged with frustration. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Mom. I don't know. It's complicated. I've been trying to balance everything, and it's been hard. But canceling my card, that felt like an attack." My heart sank as I listened to him. It wasn't the apology I had hoped for, but at least there was a small acknowledgement of my pain. "I didn't want to hurt you," I said, my voice cracking. "I just didn't know how else to get your attention. I feel like I've lost you, and I don't know how to get you back." He didn't respond immediately. The silence between us was thick, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for us to bridge this gap. "I'm sorry, Mom. I really am. I'll talk to her, okay? We'll figure this out. I don't want to lose you. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a crack in the wall that had built up between us over the years." Over the next few weeks, we continued to talk, though it was slow and difficult. There were many more moments of discomfort, many more conversations that circled around boundaries and expectations. He admitted that he had been feeling the pressure of balancing his marriage and his relationship with me. There were things he hadn't known how to communicate, and things I hadn't realized I was doing that made him feel suffocated. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. But as we began to rebuild, piece by piece, I realized that sometimes the road to healing is paved with uncomfortable truths and difficult conversations. And while we weren't back to where we once were, there was at least a chance that we could move forward, together, albeit cautiously. As I sat in the stillness of my home, the events of the past few weeks kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. It wasn't just the outburst from my son that had hurt me, nor was it just the cancellation of his credit card. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my son and me. It was about the growing influence of his wife, a woman who seemed to have become a central force in his life. And for the first time, I couldn't help but wonder how much of this distance between us was due to her, and how much of it was simply the natural course of a child growing up and moving away. I had always tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, welcoming her into our family with open arms. At first, she seemed to be a good match for my son, polite, intelligent, and driven. They seemed happy together, and I wanted nothing more than for him to be happy. But over time, something shifted. It wasn't that she was overtly controlling, but there was a subtle, almost invisible power dynamic at play that I couldn't ignore. She had a way of making decisions for the both of them, whether it was about where they would spend holidays or which friends they would associate with. At first, I told myself that maybe this was just how their relationship worked. Maybe she was simply the more assertive one, and he was happy to go along with it. But it became clear that it wasn't just about preferences or convenience. It was about control. The more I observed, the more I realized how much my son deferred to her, and not just in small matters, but in big decisions that had a direct impact on our family. There were moments when I tried to voice my concerns, moments when I would casually mention my feelings or ask about their plans, but each time I was met with a subtle dismissal, as if my opinion no longer mattered. At first I brushed it off, telling myself that they were a young couple, just starting out, and maybe I was being overly sensitive. But as the months went by, it became harder and harder to ignore the growing sense of exclusion. The more she exerted her influence, the further I felt pushed to the sidelines. It wasn't just that she was controlling. It was that my son seemed to have entirely given up his autonomy. I could see it in the way he interacted with her, the way he would look to her for approval before making even the smallest of decisions. He was no longer the independent, confident young man I had raised. Instead, he was almost always looking to her, deferring to her, seeking her validation. There was something deeply unsettling about it, and I couldn't quite shake the feeling that he had lost a part of himself in the process. What troubled me the most was the way he seemed to need her validation above everything else. It was as if he no longer felt confident enough in his own decisions to make them without her input. And while I tried to understand that a healthy relationship involves compromise and mutual respect, I couldn't help but feel like my son was losing his identity in the process. The boy who used to turn to me for advice, the one who trusted my judgment, was now deferring to her every move. It was as if I no longer existed in the same way I once had. But was it her fault? Was she truly manipulating him? Or was this simply the natural course of a young couple building their life together? And if she was controlling, was he simply going along with it because he didn't know any better? I found myself caught in this web of questions, unsure of where to place the blame, or if blame was even the right thing to assign. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this situation wasn't as black and white as I wanted it to be. Yes, there were moments when she exerted too much control, but I also had to acknowledge the role my son played in this dynamic. He wasn't a passive participant in all of this. He made choices, he allowed himself to be led by her, and he chose not to stand up for our relationship when it mattered. He had changed, but in a way that left me feeling like I had lost him to someone else. As much as I wanted to blame her, the truth was that my son had made a choice, and that choice had left me out in the cold. He had chosen to prioritize his relationship with her over the one we shared, and I couldn't help but feel hurt by that. It wasn't just about the big moments, the holidays, the decisions. It was about the small things, too. The little ways he used to lean on me for support, the way he would check in, the way he would seek my advice. That had all stopped, and it was as if he had quietly, and without warning, moved on from me. In the quiet moments when I reflected on it all, I couldn't help but question my own role in this family. Had I been overbearing in the past? Had I been too involved in his life? Too insistent on having a say in the decisions he made? Maybe I had smothered him with too much advice, or made him feel like he couldn't make choices without my input. I began to wonder if my actions had contributed to this growing distance. Had I, in my desire to remain close to him, inadvertently pushed him away? But as much as I questioned myself, there was also a sense of betrayal that I couldn't ignore. He had moved away from me in a way that felt like it had been orchestrated by her, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was simply an afterthought in their world, a secondary figure who had no place in the family he was building. I had watched him grow into the man he was, but now it seemed like he was being reshaped by someone else's vision of what his life should look like. In these moments of self-reflection, I also began to question what had happened to the relationship we once had. We used to be so close. We used to share everything, our thoughts, our dreams, our fears. Now, it felt like there was an invisible wall between us, a wall built on his loyalty to her, on their shared life that I had no part in. I missed the days when I was the one he turned to for advice, when my opinion mattered in his decisions, when I was the first person he called when he needed support. Was I mourning the loss of my son? Or was I simply mourning the loss of the role I once played in his life? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that something had changed, something that left me feeling like I no longer had a place in his world. And as much as I tried to reconcile the distance between us, it seemed like the gap only grew wider with each passing day. I realized that, in my heart, I was still trying to hold on to the boy I had raised. I hadn't let go of him, not completely. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe I needed to accept that he was no longer that boy. He was an adult now, with his own family, and I had to respect that. But that didn't mean I had to accept the loss of our connection. In the end, I realized that my role in this family had changed, and perhaps it was time to let go of the past. It didn't mean I had to accept the dynamic between him and his wife, but I did need to understand that things would never be the same. The question was, could I learn to navigate this new phase of our relationship, or would I continue to feel like an outsider in my own family? Only time would tell. The days that followed the tense silence were the hardest I had ever faced. I was exhausted from the emotional weight of what had happened, my son's words, the subsequent fallout, the growing distance between us all. It felt as though the walls between my son, his wife, and me were thicker than ever, an invisible barrier that neither of us knew how to break. The phone calls and texts, though minimal, were shallow, and the days stretched on without any real resolution. Every conversation left me feeling more distant, more isolated. But eventually my son called and asked to meet. "Can we talk? Really talk?" His voice sounded hesitant but sincere. And in that moment, I realized that this might be my only chance to repair what was left of our relationship. I agreed, though my heart raced at the prospect of facing both him and his wife together. We decided to meet at a small cafe, somewhere neutral, where we could hopefully speak openly without the weight of home and family hovering over us. I arrived early, sitting at a small corner table, my fingers tracing the edge of my coffee cup as I waited. The noise of the cafe felt distant, muted by the flood of thoughts running through my mind. I had spent the days before this meeting reflecting on everything, the good times, the bad times, and all the things I had failed to say in the heat of the moment. I wasn't sure if this conversation would heal anything, but I knew it was the only way forward. When they arrived, my son looked tired, his face a mixture of frustration and apprehension. His wife, on the other hand, held a quiet but determined composure. There was no warm greeting, no small talk. We all sat down in silence, the weight of the past few weeks hanging over us. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was as if we were all waiting for someone else to break the ice. Finally, I couldn't bear the quiet any longer. "I don't know where to start," I said, my voice shaky, "but I need you both to understand how hurt I am. I've felt rejected, pushed aside, and like my place in your lives no longer matters. You're my son, and I've always tried to be there for you. But lately it feels like I'm losing you. And when you told me, 'My wife calls the shots here, you're leaving,' I felt like I was being erased." My voice cracked as I spoke, the rawness of my emotions spilling out in a way I hadn't anticipated. For a brief moment, I looked at both of them, hoping for some acknowledgement, some sign that they understood the depth of my pain. My son's eyes were downcast, and his wife sat stiffly across from me, her hands folded on the table. I could feel the tension building in the space between us. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," my son said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of guilt and frustration. "But it's hard, Mom. You don't get it. It's not just about you and me. It's about her, too. It's about our life together. And sometimes it feels like you're trying to insert yourself into things that don't involve you anymore." His words were sharp, but there was a vulnerability in them that I hadn't expected. I had always viewed him as someone who had it all figured out, who didn't need anyone's guidance. But hearing him speak like this, I realized that he, too, was struggling with something he hadn't known how to express. "I know it seems like I'm pushing you away, but I don't mean to," he continued. "I'm just trying to figure out how to balance everything. My marriage, my career, my life. I don't always know how to do it without feeling guilty." The words hit me harder than I had expected. I had thought of his behavior as simply choosing his wife over me. But I had never stopped to consider that he might feel torn between us, caught in the middle of expectations from both sides. I hadn't understood that he wasn't just rejecting me, but also wrestling with his own feelings of inadequacy and guilt. His wife remained quiet for a moment, but then she spoke up, her tone surprisingly soft. "I know this is hard for you, and I don't want you to feel like we're trying to push you out of his life. But things between us, his and mine, they've changed, and they need to. It's not just about him being my husband. It's about us trying to create a life together that works for us both. It's complicated, and I don't know how to make it easier." Her words were a shift from the coldness I had felt before. There was something raw and human in them, something that made me see her not as a barrier between my son and me, but as a woman who, too, was navigating the difficult waters of a young marriage. "I didn't mean for it to turn into this," she continued, her voice quieter now. "I know I can be difficult sometimes, and I know that I've made you feel like you're not as important, but I never wanted to take him away from you." There it was, the admission, the vulnerability. She didn't try to defend herself or justify her actions. She simply acknowledged that there was a problem, that she too felt conflicted, and that her intentions had never been to hurt me. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like I was hearing the truth, raw, unfiltered, and unguarded. I felt my own defenses begin to lower. "I know things have changed. I know you're building your own life together, but it's hard for me too. I'm not ready to let go of the person you used to be, and I don't know how to find my place in this new version of you." My son reached out across the table and touched my hand. "I don't want to lose you, Mom. I really don't. But I need you to understand that I can't always be the person you want me to be. I need to be my own person now." The words stung, but they also hit home. He was right. I had been holding on to an image of him that no longer existed. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for me to let go. Not of him, but of the version of him I had built in my mind, the one who would always need me in the same way he did when he was younger. "I understand," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry if I've made you feel like you had to choose between us. I never wanted that. I just wanted to be part of your life, however that looked." The conversation was far from easy, and there was no immediate resolution. But there was something in that moment, a shift in our dynamic, a recognition that we all had things to work through. We all had feelings to express, struggles to overcome, and misunderstandings to untangle. And though the conversation didn't fix everything, it opened the door for healing, for new boundaries, and for a deeper understanding of one another. As we left the cafe, there was no magical moment of reconciliation, but there was something more important, a willingness to keep talking, to keep trying. We weren't going to solve everything in one conversation, but it was a start. We had cracked the wall between us, and now, it was up to all of us to decide how we would rebuild what had been broken. There would be more conversations, more discomfort, and more growth. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope that in time, we could navigate this new chapter of our relationship, together, as a family, even if it looked different than it had before. The days following our heartfelt conversation at the cafe were a blur of mixed emotions, a complex tangle of relief, regret, hope, and uncertainty. But as time passed, I knew that healing, true, meaningful healing, wasn't something that would just happen overnight. It would take effort, patience, and a willingness to move forward, despite the hurt and confusion we had all experienced. We had begun the journey of understanding, but the real work was still ahead of us. I found myself waiting for a sign, some kind of indication that my son and I could bridge the gap that had formed between us. The first few days after our meeting were still marked by hesitation, the lingering discomfort of unsaid things. But as the silence continued, I realized that waiting for him to make the first move wasn't going to heal anything. If I truly wanted to restore our bond, I needed to be the one to step forward, even if it felt vulnerable and uncertain. I started small. I sent him a message, a simple text, no long speeches or expectations. just a few words that I hoped would reach the heart of the matter. "I'm thinking of you. Hope we can talk more soon." It was an olive branch, a gentle opening to continue the conversation we had started, and it felt like the right step, even though I was afraid of rejection. But to my relief, within a few hours he responded, "Thanks, Mom. I think we need to keep talking too." The words were brief, but they were enough. For the first time in what felt like ages, there was no defensiveness, no cold distance, just the beginning of a bridge being built between us. That was the moment I realized that, while the pain of the past week still lingered, there was something new forming between us, a willingness to rebuild. Over the next few weeks, our conversations grew more frequent. They weren't always easy. Sometimes they were awkward, filled with pauses as we tried to figure out how to navigate the tension of the past. But each time we talked, there was a little more understanding, a little more recognition of our shared history, and more importantly, our shared desire to heal. I tried to be patient, giving him the space he needed, but also making sure he knew I was there, that I loved him and wanted to be a part of his life, without overstepping, without pushing too hard. In those moments, I had to remind myself that it wasn't about going back to what we had before, but about building something new, something more mature, something that respected the boundaries we both needed to establish. One of the most important steps I took during this period of healing was recognizing the need for forgiveness. Not just for him, but for myself. For so long I had held on to the hurt, clinging to my feelings of betrayal and abandonment, but in doing so, I was also holding on to the very thing that kept me from moving forward. I realized that if I wanted to repair our relationship, I had to let go of the past and forgive him for the things he had said, and for the things I had interpreted as rejection. And most importantly, I needed to forgive myself for expecting him to remain the person I had always known him to be. It wasn't easy. It took time, but with each conversation I started to let go. I began to understand his position more clearly, not just as my son, but as an adult man, grappling with his own struggles, his own need to create boundaries, and his own desire to make his own decisions. That was the moment I realized that forgiveness wasn't just about absolution. It was about understanding and acceptance. For my son, the process of healing was just as important, though it was something he struggled with privately. He didn't always know how to articulate what he was feeling, but I could sense the weight of it in his words. There were moments when he expressed guilt over how he had treated me, how he had taken me for granted. But there were also moments when he struggled with his own emotions, caught between his loyalty to me and his loyalty to his wife, trying to navigate the complicated web of family dynamics. One evening, he called me, his voice hesitant. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. I didn't realize how much my actions hurt you. I was so focused on trying to make everyone happy that I lost sight of what mattered most. I'm sorry." His apology wasn't just a formality, it felt real. There was a rawness in his words that made me realize how much he had been carrying, how much he had been trying to figure out on his own. I could hear the regret in his voice, the acknowledgement of the mistakes he had made, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in him. He was growing, learning, and it was clear that he was beginning to recognize the complexities of his role in our family. "I'm proud of you for seeing that," I replied, my voice soft. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them, and we try to do better." In the weeks that followed, we had more conversations, sometimes deep, sometimes uncomfortable, but always filled with a willingness to move forward. There were times when we stumbled, when old habits resurfaced, but each time we took a step backward, we made sure to take two forward. Slowly, but surely, the emotional chasm between us began to close. The journey of rebuilding, however, wasn't just about our individual healing. It was about the family unit as a whole. As we began to repair our relationship, my son and his wife also started to redefine their own boundaries. There were moments of tension, moments where old patterns of control resurfaced, but they worked through it together, with an open dialogue about their needs and expectations. In these conversations, I made it clear that while I would always offer love and support, I also had to respect their space, their life, and their decisions as a couple. That was a difficult realization for me to come to, accepting that my place in their world had changed. But it was a necessary one. I had to learn to respect their boundaries, to step back and allow them the room to grow and navigate their own relationship. But there were also small gestures that helped rebuild trust and affection. A simple text from my son asking how my day was, or his wife sending me a recipe she thought I would like. These moments of thoughtfulness began to rebuild the emotional connection that had been fractured. It wasn't always grand gestures, but rather the small acts of kindness that showed we were all still willing to invest in each other. We also made time to be together, as a family, in ways that didn't feel forced or awkward. A Sunday dinner, a quiet afternoon watching a movie, even a phone call just to check in. It was the return of the small, everyday moments that reminded us of the love and bond we shared, even if it had been hidden under the weight of unspoken tensions for so long. Through this process, I realized that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't something that happened in a set timeline. It was a journey full of ups and downs, small victories, and occasional setbacks. But the most important thing was that we were all willing to work through the discomfort, to communicate openly and honestly, and to rebuild trust in a way that respected each other's individuality while also honoring our shared past. As we moved forward, I could see the changes in all of us. My son had learned to balance his independence with his responsibilities to his family, both his wife and me. I had learned to step back, to let go of old expectations, and to accept him for who he had become. And his wife, while still figuring out her place in the family dynamic, had taken steps to be more understanding, more open to the complexities of our relationship. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but we were rebuilding. Slowly, steadily, with each conversation, each moment of vulnerability, and each act of kindness, we were finding our way back to each other, one step at a time. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that has transpired over the past few months, I realize how much has changed, not just between my son and me, but within myself as well. The journey we've been on has been painful at times, yes, but it's also been one of growth, understanding, and ultimately, acceptance. For so long, I had held on to a version of my son that no longer fit, a version of him that I couldn't seem to let go of. But through this process, through the hurt, the silence, and the hard conversations, I've learned that family isn't about holding on to the past. It's about evolving, about learning how to navigate the changes, and about accepting each other for who we are, not who we once were. I've come to understand that my son's independence doesn't mean he loves me any less. It doesn't mean he's rejecting me. It simply means that he's growing, as he should. It's natural for children to become adults, to form their own lives, and to create families of their own. That was something I had always known intellectually. But it took this difficult period for me to truly feel it in my heart. Letting go of the version of him I had held so tightly to was painful, but it also brought me peace. I could finally see him for who he is now, not the boy I raised, but the man he's becoming. I also realized that his wife, the person I once viewed as a barrier between us, is an integral part of his life, and by extension, she is an integral part of my life too. In the past, I had resented the way she seemed to influence his decisions, how their relationship felt like it had edged me out. But now I see that she too is simply trying to find her place in the world, just as I am. She's not the enemy, she's his partner, someone he trusts and loves. And if I am to have a relationship with him, then I must respect and accept her role in that relationship. It's not easy, but it's something I'm learning, one step at a time. The lessons I've learned are not just about relationships, but about myself. I've had to come to terms with my own role as a parent, one that's constantly changing. I used to believe that being a good parent meant being involved in every aspect of my child's life, guiding them at every turn, and offering advice at every opportunity. But what I've learned is that sometimes the most loving thing I can do is step back, let go, and allow them to chart their own course. It's not about control, but about trust. Trusting that they have the strength, the wisdom, and the ability to make decisions for themselves. The hardest part of this journey has been accepting the changes in our family dynamic. But I've come to realize that this doesn't mean love is lost. It just means that love looks different now. The bond I share with my son is not gone. It's simply evolving. We are learning to navigate this new chapter of our relationship, one where boundaries are respected, where space is given, but where love remains at the core. Looking ahead, I feel a sense of peace that I didn't have before. The road to healing wasn't easy, and there are still bumps along the way. But I know now that healing is possible. I've forgiven my son, and I've forgiven myself. I've learned to accept the changes that come with life and relationships. And I've learned that love isn't something that can be controlled or dictated. It's something that must be nurtured, allowed to grow in its own time and space. I'm at peace with the decisions I've made and the path I've chosen. Moving forward, I will continue to offer my support and love, but I will do so with a sense of freedom. Freedom to let go, freedom to trust, and freedom to embrace the changes, knowing that family, in all its complexity, is still the most important thing in my life. And though things may never be exactly as they once were, I know that the love we share will always remain, strong, resilient, and ever evolving.